Welcome back to Worth Different Woodworking and the 6th video in our Start Woodworking series. I think we're about midway through the semester, so I guess you could call this your midterm. A midterm in a class that's using a very small set of woodworking tools, plus a bandsaw and a bench we built to be able to learn some basic woodworking skills so that you can build just about anything in your house on a simple scale. Stuff like shelves, chests, that kind of stuff. So we've already built, the first class we built this very simple workbench. And the overall learning goal I had of it, besides just having a workbench that actually functions, is to give y'all that sensation, that feel of handling a saw through wood, because a lot of new woodworkers struggle with it. They bind on stuff like that. They have to learn to relax and let the saw do their work. The second class, we went over a lot of tools, but the second big project we did was building this tool chest to house all the tools we'll be using in the course, other than the bandsaw. In that, we refined our sawing skills and introduced hand planes and chisels, the holy trinity of hand tools, so to speak. But the big thing that we learned was refining our sawing skills. This project, it was rough sawing skills. That project, we were working to a line. Now, all the angles on that were 90 degrees, and if we messed up a little bit, we could compensate with good quality design. The third project we did was this shelf system. Now, I built one to house all my chucks, but I left the diameters up to y'all. And in this one, we really refined our sawing skills. It didn't become just sawing to the line. We were getting very accurate parallel lines so that we could force these shelves to compress in their dados to make this thing really, really strong with just a little bit of glue. Now, for this kind of midterm project, we're going to make a box, which is kind of the foundation of a lot of the things we make. A simple box. And I am not going to introduce any new skills. All we are going to do is refine the skills we've already developed building stuff like this and apply them in a new way. But for some reason, people take that idea of applying what you already know, what you already can do slightly differently, and they seem to think that it adds a lot of complexity. It adds infinitely more skill, and it just doesn't. And that's what I want you to get on this project, because for this box, we're introducing dovetails. And dovetails are just the same exact things, same exact sawing techniques, except over a lot shorter distance than these shelves did. The same exact distance we used on our box, and that worked perfectly fine. All we are doing is adding an angle. I hope, well, I really don't hope it, but more than likely you're coming into this thinking dovetails are really hard, and I hope that this dispels that completely so that you realize that it doesn't matter what the joint is. Mortise and tenon, dovetails, sliding dovetails, blind scarf joints, all that kind of stuff. It all comes back down to having the skill to saw to the line and applying it slightly differently. So, today, let's make a dovetail box. Now, the dimensions of this project, I'm leaving completely up to you. Build something that you could actually use. Me personally, last project we built the shelves for all my chucks, but chucks come with lots of different parts, little things like this. So I'm going to build a box that's going to fit in this middle section that will hold the screws and jaws for my chucks. The dimensions really don't matter. It's the lesson that's going to be important. And this is not going to be an overly complex dovetail box. This is as simple as I can make it. I do not want to introduce any more skills for you to learn. We are just applying them differently. Now, material-wise, I'm starting at same 1x8. If you remember the last lesson, I screwed this thing up and I had to go buy more wood to make these two shelves. This is the board I made those two shelves out of. And I happen to have the two ones I screwed up. So if you add those back in, you're looking at a 1x8 by about 6 foot. And that's all we're going to need to make this box. Now I have this thing about design, and I talked about this when we built this, was that each time you go down in a design, whether you're going from the side to the shelves, it always looks better if it's a little bit thinner. This was 3/4 of an inch. This went down to 1/2 inch. So on the box itself, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch and 3/8 inch material simply by machining this down, which you can do either with a hand plane or machines. But for the lesson itself, that is completely irrelevant. I'm purposely going to make the fronts and the sides different thicknesses to show you a lesson in applying what we previously learned in harder situations. Okay, we are starting with our 4 boards. These boards are sized so that they will fit in the space required. And traditionally when I'm making drawers or boxes to fit and stuff like that, that's the easiest way to do it. I don't really care what the exact measurements are as long as they fit in the area. Though on the sides I have it spaced so that they are a 1/2 inch shorter, just to complicate it a little bit and give us a spot for the top. And as I discussed earlier, the two sides are actually narrower than the front and the back. So the first thing we need to do is figure out which way we want the dovetails to go. Now traditionally when you're making a drawer, you're pulling this way. So it's wise to have the tails on this side, meaning the V on this side, so that we'll have straight lines across. I also like the fact that when you are looking at your drawer from the front, you won't see a lot of angles right here. I personally do not find dovetails that attractive to look at because they're like fringe. They're angles coming out at all different directions on the side of a piece. That's basically fringe. So if you can have some uniformity there, that's great. But the key things we're going to need in our design is 2 different thicknesses of boards and 2 different heights of boards. Now those 2 factors affect nothing about the skill required to make this box. All it is an adjustment of your layout. Skill-wise, we are still just going to be sawing to a line, taking a line, or leaving a line. Very basic stuff that you can accomplish. Now, if after this lesson you have questions or want more information on how to cut a dovetail, I've actually done 4 feature-length videos on dovetails. I did one a long time ago where I didn't have very good camera equipment or audio equipment, but it covered a lot of information. I have a second one where I showed you how to correct errors when you make dovetails. You know, you had too gappy or angles or anything like that. How to fix your dovetails. And then about a year ago, I showed you 2 different ways of cutting dovetails. One, the no measure way, and one a little bit more fussy, probably the more commonly taught way of doing dovetails. And both of those, I dove deep into a lot of the details. Today we are just making a basic utilitarian box. I just want you to get through this step so you know how to do it and you have confidence in yourself. Nothing's going to be complex about it. Just pick something from your shop that you need to have a box for, and let's make a box for that. So I'm going to kind of combine those 2 different methods of the no measuring box design and the more fussy design and give you a way I commonly do utilitarian boxes. And as I do this, you're going to see me using a pencil. This is a mistake. Don't use a pencil. Use a knife. You will get much better results. You'll have much better feel if you have indentation lines that you can feel and your saw can follow versus just a pencil line. The reason why I'm going to use a pencil is because of the camera. Camera doesn't always pick up these knife lines and it can confuse people if you don't see what I'm talking about. So I'm using a pencil, which also means I'm probably going to induce a little bit more gaps because I don't have those indentations. And the first thing I'm going to be doing is marking off the top of the taller of all the boards so that I can, from this point forward, ignore it. I'm just going to treat these taller boards as the shorter boards up to that point. Now here's a key thing whenever you're marking any kind of line, be it with a knife or a pencil. You can still see that pencil line because I put it on top of the board, meaning it's on top of the board. So if I ever remove that pencil line, that means I'm removing a part of the wood that needs to slide on top of this piece. And that's incredibly important when you're talking dovetails, because a lot of times you need to cut so that you leave the line, because that's part of the wood that's going to slide between the two pieces. Next up, I like to look at all the grains and determine which is the best looking piece, and I'm going to put that in front. I'm picking this one because the grain is kind of uniform. This one has a little bit of cathedral, so that's going to be my front, and then the two sides, just like that. Once you have that, on this particular box, I am going to label all the bottoms, because you never will see the bottoms. And when I say label, I'll just put, you know, A, B, B, C. So the first thing we need to do is mark our baselines. I am a big fan of using either a knife or preferably a chisel for doing this, instead of using a marking gauge, because I find it's faster and it takes inaccuracies out of the picture. If there's variations in thicknesses of boards, using one marking gauge and then resetting it to the other marking gauge and then having to reset it and stuff like that, well, if you have two marking gauges, that takes care of that problem. But it introduces the opportunity for errors. So the way you can do that is take your chisel, have this angle so that we're going to be dragging this way, and the bevel pointing up, so it's absolutely flush with the board, just overhanging a little bit. Then you can take your board and you practice a few times sliding it back and forth, then just come over and just slide it down, and you're going to make a nice straight line. Since I'm using a pencil, I actually have to be a little bit more careful, and this time I have to push it, otherwise you're going to snap that pencil lead off. The key thing is, even if you break it off and you get a thicker line, just make sure you saw to the line, but you don't take the line. Then you do the same exact thing using the thicker board to mark the thinner board. And that way you don't risk ever messing up which board has which thickness. Now, once you've got all your baselines marked up, I cannot stress it enough. Reassemble it how it's going to go together. And every time you do anything with it, come back and reassemble again. There's nothing more frustrating than getting a perfectly fitted dovetail and then realizing that on the other side it was upside down. So your box isn't going to go together and you pretty much need to start over, or at least redo one side, which you're going to be starting over anyways. Now, because this is a utilitarian joint and I am doing tails first, and one of the biggest advantages of doing tails first is you can gang cut stuff. Meaning, I'm going to cut the two sides with tails at the same time. So set one side of your vise to the thickness of the boards. Then adjust the other side. Then, hopefully your two sides are identically sized. Mine are a little bit off, but that's okay. Drop it down, tighten it up. Now the key thing you want is to line up as best you can right now. Now layout wise, in my other videos, I show tricks on how to use dividers and all that kind of stuff to get it very uniform. But if I'm just doing a utilitarian drawer, a lot of times I would just use something like this right here to come over from the edge an equal amount, and that's where my dovetails are going to start. And I'll do this layout on the first one, and then I will transfer it to the second side. There we have an equal divider, so it will start to look uniform. Now decide how many you want in the middle. A lot of times I find it looks cool to have balanced dovetails, but not necessarily the same size dovetails. So if you want to, you can make the center one bigger than the two outside, and a lot of times I would just use my dovetail marking gauge to mark the thickness of those, and then all I need to do is decide I want my dividers, the division, to be the same. So mark that, and now I will have two small dovetails on the outside, two small tails on the outside, one big tail in the middle. And this 90 degrees is the only one that's kind of critical, which is another advantage of ganging them up together, because it's easier to draw a straight line over a longer distance. That's why rifles are easier to shoot than pistols, because a rifle barrel is a lot longer. If you have a shorter board, it's easier to get off a little bit. Now, when we cut the finger joints on our toolbox, I proved to you that even though the carcass saw, which is set up for cross-cutting, is perfectly fine for cutting those finger joints, and you can get very, very accurate cuts with it. So you could use this forever and have that as your only back saw, especially on boxes this size. Also, on my previous video, I taught y'all how to turn a $20 gent saw into a very nice cutting dovetail saw. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and introduce a dovetail saw, which is filed rip, and since we are cutting a rip cut right here, this is probably the more appropriate saw. They call it a dovetail saw, but in my mind that is a misnaming of the tool. It's really just a small joinery saw, and I like it for smaller items. That's all it comes down to. A carcass saw or a sash saw, which is the same exact saw with rip file teeth, would be perfectly fine for this if that's all you got. Now the sawing action for me basically comes down to, I will use my finger to position this corner of the saw right next to the pencil line. I will then kind of nibble my way to start it and then make a few strokes all the way across. Okay. Now to find, some of y'all have noticed that I have not marked any kind of angle. Well, I basically created a saw kerf depth right there, and as you gain some practice, you'll figure out that that's 3 or 4 strokes, you count them out, will let the saw fall to a certain angle, one way or the other. So I'll let that right there set my angles, and they turn out to be fairly consistent. And even if they are not, this is going to be on the side of our box, so side of your drawer, so we won't really be able to tell. So once again, use my finger to line it up, get the saw kerf going on one side, nibble my way across, making sure I leave the pencil line, allow the kerf to set, and then come down to the baseline. On one side, right it up on the other side. And always go back and mark an X on all the parts that you're going to be removing. Now for efficiency's sake, many times I will not remove the waste at this point in time. Some people will use a coping saw, which I do quite a bit, but for this time I'm not going to. I'm just going to do all the sawing first and all the chopping second. So in order to transfer the lines, I basically come back over here and I can make a pencil line at the transition point. This does not have to be ultimately accurate, because when you assemble the box, they are going to be 10 inches apart. So as long as the proportions are the same and it looks pretty much the same, you'll be okay. So now I can come over, drop it in the vise, and then transfer all those lines across. Then rinse and repeat with the saw. When you're done with that, put them back in their right orientation. I cannot stress that enough. Now, one way of transferring the exact angles from one board to the other that I have not shown before is take a board like this, plop it down in front of your vise, and then transfer your lines like we did those finger joints. See? No way to get it out of order if we do it like this. Now the key thing is, you want this board to be right underneath this one right here. So what I would do, I will flatten it out on this one, tighten up the vise. Remember, we've readjusted this side so it's this exact thickness, so all you ever have to worry about is this side whenever you're tightening things up. So now it's flush, and this board will sit right on top of it. Then making sure it's flush on this side, because that side is the part of the wood that where we drew the line, where we're kind of ignoring that piece. And then you can take your saw, drop it right in that kerf, and just draw back a few times, just to create that scratch. Make sure you do not move the board. And when you're done, you should have all your lines. And because the saw was in the kerf line, and that kerf is part of the wood that should be coming up, when you saw this out, what you want to do is actually come up right next to that line, because we're going to be removing these pieces right here, and that crushed piece of wood fiber has to come up into the slot. So just use your forefinger to line it up right next to that. Get the saw going. Come back over, and this time, instead of letting the saw fall one way or another, just keep it balanced straight up and down, and you should be okay. Now, if you really do want to, you can draw a line straight up and down using your gauge. I just think it takes a little bit too much time, and that's a fairly short distance, so I trust gravity to keep my saw going straight up and down. Nibble, try not to fall into that kerf. That's why your finger is there to keep it. Just saw straight down. Move it over, nibble, saw straight down. Now, I will say this, normally when I know I'm going to be doing a lot of dovetailing, I'll leave my index fingernail line, and you can actually put a fingernail in that kerf, and that will give you that fence that you like, so that you don't saw in the kerf. And because the saw teeth are cutting below the line, you know, it's not going to damage your fingernail. Now, once that last dovetail is cut, it's time to start removing the waste, which includes sawing the corners of all those side pieces. Now, I know a lot of y'all are going to be tempted to saw slightly off the line and plane back with the chisel, because that's what you see a lot of people do online. Don't. Just saw to the line and get it over with. I have faith in you that you can do it. And even if you're slightly off, that little bit of gap is going to be out of the way. Nobody's really going to see it. Nobody's really going to notice it. Just saw to the line. I have faith in you. You can do it. Your only real focus is just not going past the line. I mean, you were doing that in kindergarten with crayons, right? Just don't color past the line. You can do it. Though yeah, you might need to use a chisel to clean up the interior corner. We won't call that cheating. Now when it does come time to chop out the waste, if you remember back when we were doing the tool chest, we only chop halfway through. We do not chop all the way from one side to the other. Because of that, you don't really have to worry about going into your workbench. All you need to worry about is not going past halfway. Now in the interest of saving time, a lot of times when I'm doing a box, I'll do one box at a time, not a whole series of boxes, but I will start stacking them. That way I can do the removable material, the chopping, kind of without having to reorganize stuff a whole bunch. And I don't change the method of chopping. Basically, I start halfway to the knife line. Is if I didn't cope it out, and even if I cope it out, I will go halfway to the knife line. But by stacking it kind of like this, you just have everything in the right order. Then you flip it and do the other side halfway to that knife line. And then just keep repeating that process until you get all the way through. But the advantage of this method is you flip the board, you flip more than one board at a time. And it just seems to go quicker because you're not having to move as much. Then once you got half of them all the way done, come back again halfway to the knife line. And you just keep repeating until you can't go halfway to the knife line and you just have to go to your baseline. But each time you come halfway back down, you're going to find you go a little bit deeper until eventually you're just shaving everything off. Then on the last one, just be careful, especially if you have a pencil line and you do not have that knife line for it to fall into, they get it right on. I will tell you, when I do pencil lines, I always get one or two of them slightly off and it creates a gap. That's why I do not like using the pencil. The one downside to this is that it seems like you're going to be working forever doing this repetitive chopping, but in reality it's a lot quicker. It's just you don't finish a component in a few minutes. It's like you finish all of them in 10 minutes at once. So it's kind of a little bit less of a instant gratification. Clean up the corners because there's always a little schmutz in there. And then I am one of those that if I can get them going by hand a little bit, whoops, then that's good enough for me, and I will go ahead and put the glue on and clamp them down. But if one of them is a little bit tight, if you take a mallet and just some light taps on it, what will happen is you will compress the fibers a little bit and you'll see where you need to maybe shave ever so slightly to make it fit. All you're doing is shaving away the burnish marks so they'll slide a little bit easier. And I will tell you, this top one right here, I have some huge gaps. I don't know what went wrong there, but see, that's going on, so that's now good enough for me. So as you can see, I can tap on it. It's a little bit tight, so if I kind of take it off, I look for any compression, and that's where I know I need to ever so slightly shave it down. Preferably shaving it down towards the back and not the front, because the back won't be, if you shave too much, it won't show as badly on the gap edge. Another trick is to use a metal hammer because, can you hear the difference? The tightness is on this one, not this one. There's a noticeable sound difference. check for any burnishing, and then shave it down. Oh, big sound difference. See how it's more even now. So once they all go a little bit, it's time to glue them up. So on this glue up, I'm using hide glue just because pine will swell quite a bit with water, and normal PVA is water based, so it will soak in. Hide glue actually acts a little bit like a lubricant to make the glue up go a little bit easier, but it takes a lot longer to dry. But I'm going to let this dry overnight, so I don't really care. And as always, grab extra chopsticks when you go get Chinese food, because they make the best glue spreaders I know of. Now I know a lot of people put a lot of glue on their dovetails, but I really don't think that they need that much. The glue is only there to hold it together so that the mechanical joint can work. And there isn't much force spreading a drawer apart. So just a little bit of glue is all you need. Even what I'm doing now is probably overkill. Oh yeah, really messed up that one, but oh well. The fact that it's taking a hammer to get together and it's not coming apart tells me it's going to work just fine. Now something I found out is that once you get the joints pretty tight, you know, with either squeezing it with a clamp, well, you can almost take the clamps off immediately, as if you just planed your work, it's not going to warp that much, and it's not going to come apart, so to speak. And yeah, I'm kind of aggressive with a hammer, but because of that, the hard part is getting it square. And one of the easiest tricks I know of is, if you don't have any squeeze out, or if you do, put blue tape around your corners to prevent that. And then just find wherever you're going to be putting it and slide it in. And let it dry here, because now it's going to form to its pocket. And if this is slightly off, well, they'll now match. Now after it's dry, you might notice, you know, a few gaps that you didn't notice before. And I do have an earlier video I talked about earlier that talks about filling gaps. But here's a trick that I didn't mention in there. And it's another reason why a hand plane a lot of times is better than sandpaper. For the most part, spelching is a bad thing. And spelching is when on the back side of a board, if you're planing or something like that, because there's no support out here in air for fibers, a lot of times they will just kind of break off. See how I did that right there? And then you get this crack and it's ugly and stuff like that. That's one of the bad things about planing off of end grain, is all this torn fiber. But if you have a slight gap on the edge, say like right here, well, if you can just plane that end grain over, it will spelch into those gaps. And that's just not something you can do if you are sanding. The sanding won't cause that gap filling aspect. And that includes if your gaps are kind of going to the side a little bit too. Also, I noticed this one corner right here, evidently I didn't get any glue on there. So one trick is, if you have some thin CA glue, squeeze it in just a drop or two on the end grain, and it'll wick down in there. Let it sit a few moments, and then whenever you apply any kind of finish, that color change will kind of blend in. Another trick for planing the sides of boxes is having a bench stop right here. But if I were to come over here and plane this way, because there's no base in it yet, no top on it, well, all this force is going to want to collapse the box. I mean, we're actually pushing down this way, which is not good. So if you can get something about the height of this box, that now you can plane against here, well, now all of a sudden our force is going into here and it's not a diagonal setup. So you can get pretty aggressive on your planing of the end grain. And as you can see, that little bit of gapping is somewhat filled up by the slight spelching of the end grain. Not perfect, but better. And in the end, a little sanding to even everything out, maybe get rid of some of the last little bit of your pencil marks, and to break edges never hurts. Now at some point in time, you're going to want to start looking at evening out the gaps. Now I can look right here, I bring it up close, you can see I got a tight fit here, but I got a little bit loose fit here. So I want to even this gap out cosmetically. So, you know, your block plane to the rescue once again. Remove a little bit more over on this side than the other side. Then check it back out. Closer, maybe twice as much more. So we come back over, take more strokes. Now we have an even gap right here. But this is something I hate. You have this shadow line right here. I'm going to move the box back a little bit because that's the way I designed it. I wanted, if you bump it up against the wall, I wanted that slight reveal. But this shelf right here sits on there. So there is no gap right there, but we have a gap up front. So I want to come out even those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my block plane and just put a slight bevel on this front section. And that will create the shadow line that will give me my gap. And this is only if you are putting it in a cabinet like this right here. If you're just making a box, having that shadow line on bottom just kind of makes it stand off the base a little bit. Oh, whoops, sorry guys, I just realized I wasn't using the right block plane for this project. I'll get that one out. But now that we got the sides fitted, our shadow lines done, I'm going to work on the top first instead of the bottom. For the simple reason I want to be able to flip it over and work on this inside. And with the base not there, it's just easier to do that one. Now for mine, I'm going to be using a piece of walnut for the simple reason I have it around and I think it'll look good in the thumbnail. But use whatever you have. Preferably the pine you worked with, because it'll be a nice box that way. But I'm going to use a walnut. So by having this open base, I can now come over here and position it and maybe get some blemishes or something that will make it look cool. Kind of like that knot. So with my freshly sharpened pencil, laying it flat. And don't be afraid of playing around with bevels. I mean, this is just a shop project, but shop projects are where you get to experiment. And if you're doing bevels, I would always do the end grain first. That way, if you get any of that spelching, well, when you bevel the sides, that'll get rid of it. I just created these two little stops right here, and I forgot to turn the camera on, but basically what I did was I have my bench hook right here, and I had the offcut from the long section. If you're just using a piece of pine, that right there will work too. And I took my block plane and kind of planed it uniform. I wasn't really caring about getting perfectly. I just definitely wanted to have a smooth side here, two straight sides, and then using the block plane, I picked one corner to round over, and you just kind of use your hand when you're doing that. Just kind of hold it there and then just bring it around and just, whoops, going against the grain there. You just kind of run it over the blade until you get that nice rounded edge. So I now have a completely flat side with square edges, and on this side the two of these are rounded over. And what I'm going to do is use the ones with square edges, just a little bit of glue, doesn't require much. Make sure I'm level on both sides, and then just drop these in the center and hold them for, you know, roughly 30 seconds. And those would give you two small stops. That way, whenever you're dropping it on here, it'll just kind of center itself. Now, my opinion is boxes like this, the bottom of them should be done with grooves, meaning you slide it into a groove that you've got all the way around here, and that gives it a lot of structural strength. And with that in, we could have planed it like that without a brace here, because that would have given it its racking strength, I guess you would say. But I was trying to keep this design very, very simple, because really the focus was on doing the dovetails and just getting that out of the way as far as your skill base. So we're going to do, I think, something called slides. It's a very traditional way of doing drawer bottoms. So here we go. Oh, and I'm just going to be using a piece of leftover MDF from another project just because I have it around. Use anything you want. Now, the reason why they're calling these slides is because we're actually going to glue in something for the bottom to fit on top of. These were the offcut from the shelves I did in the last lesson. So all I really need to do is mark their length, cut them down, run a bead of glue down the smooth edge. FYI, the other side of these still have my bandsaw marks. I'm not too concerned with it because nobody's really going to check that out. And then just once again, hold it in place for about a minute. Then run a little bit of glue down each runner, and then drop in the bottom. Hold that down. And after about a minute, go ahead and lift it up and move it, and you'll see that got a little bit of squeeze out there, but it's pretty solid. You just don't want to leave it in that same spot in case a little glue squeeze out happened here. You don't want to glue it to your workbench. So there we go. About as simple a design of a box as you can come up with. Just dovetails all the way around. Somewhat of a fancy top design. Simple base. Again, my version obviously isn't necessarily a box, but a drawer, and I will eventually put a little pull handle on that, but that's irrelevant for this particular class. So there we go. A dovetail box, a simple project that works great as your midterm project, because it really was just a review of what we've learned so far and asking you to apply it in a slightly new way, meaning not at 90 degrees. So just think of what we're going to be accomplishing in the second half of this semester. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and as always, a reminder that content creators like me do this on a value for value proposition. So if you are getting something out of this series, or you think that future generations will, please consider supporting us somehow. There are lots of ways in the description down below. Every little bit really does help. And always, I want you to remember that it is always worth the effort to learn, create stuff, and share it with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.